More than halfway through the fantasy football regular season, it is week 8 of the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. We got Waiver Wire, we got Stealthy starts, and we have streaming options for week 8. Let's get it started. What's up, everybody? I'm Steven Andrus. Be sure to subscribe to our page here, like this video, and comment below if you have any fantasy football questions, trade, lineup questions. I'd be happy to answer them for you in the comments section below. Let's start this show like we do every show with our waiver wire options in our Pick 'em Up segment. And the first is the backup running back that exploded in week 7. Arizona Cardinals backup RB Chase Edmonds, who just absolutely demoralized the New York Giants for 27 carries, 126 yards, and 3 touchdowns, adding 2 receptions for 24 yards through the air. He's still owned in less than 30% of leagues, gets to take on New Orleans on the road this week. And I think a lot of people were kicking themselves for not starting him last week. He was started in less than 5% of leagues. But with David Johnson still nicked up, battling an ankle injury, a back injury before that, I think it's fair to question whether or not Edmonds has played himself into a committee in this offense with how electric he has been, not just against the Giants, but week 6 against Atlanta, 67 yards and a touchdown on 7 touches. Week 5 against Cincinnati, 86 yards and a touchdown on 11 touches. Let's see if Edmonds becomes part of a committee with David Johnson moving forward. He at least has to be owned in 100% of leagues now at this point. Among wide receiver pickups, let's look to Tennessee and Corey Davis. And I know this passing game has been pretty ugly for most of the year, but there was a key change last week, and it was Ryan Tannehill taking over at quarterback for Marcus Mariota. Mariota has been hesitant to pepper his wide receivers with targets this year, but in his first game, Tannehill was very welcoming to Corey Davis. Davis just 44% owned, and more importantly, gets to take on Tampa Bay this week. He had a season-high 7 targets against the Chargers with Tannehill at quarterback. He converted those into 6 receptions for 80 yards and a touchdown. And again, we mentioned the matchup in week 8 against the Bucs, who have allowed the second most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Another wide receiver handcuff, so to speak, and pick him up now is Kenny Stills. We have to monitor the health of Will Fuller for this pickup. Fuller left the game early against the Colts in the first quarter with a hamstring injury. If he is out, we saw what Kenny Stills can do in this offense, this high-powered passing attack with Deshaun Watson throwing him the ball. Stills went over 100 yards on just 5 targets, 4 receptions against the Colts. This is a guy who has produced in the past for fantasy. Despite playing for a dreadful Dolphins team, he had 9 touchdowns in one season in Miami. Over the course of his career, 16 yards per reception, playing for the Saints, Dolphins, and the Texans this year. And he gets to take on Oakland this week, who allowed 11 catches, 262 yards, and 2 touchdowns to the likes of Geronimo Allison, Alan Lazard, Jake Kumaro, and Marquez Valdez-Scantling. Not exactly world beaters at the wide receiver position. And the week before that, they allowed 7 receptions for 97 yards and 2 touchdowns to Allen Robinson, who plays for the Chicago Bears. And I think we all can agree Mitch Trubisky, not exactly a world beater at the quarterback position. Let's move on to our streaming options for week number 8, and we begin with quarterbacks owned in less than 50% of leagues. Matthew Stafford of the Detroit Lions gets a great matchup this week against the New York Giants. He's available in a little more than 50% of leagues at this point. The Giants are allowing 19 fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, and Stafford shredded the Vikings last week. 364 yards, 4 touchdowns, 1 pick. He has 23 plus fantasy points in half of his games this year. Those have coincided with plus matchups, and the Giants are absolutely a plus matchup in week number 8. Secondly, Kirk Cousins, the guy Stafford went up against last week. This Vikings offense is completely different from what we saw the first half of the season, and we have to adjust to that in fantasy football. Kirk Cousins is owned in less than 40% of leagues right now, and he gets to take on Washington in week 8. Cousins' last 3 games, 20.5 fantasy points, 27.3 fantasy points, and his latest effort, 29.2 fantasy points against Detroit. The Redskins this week allowing more than 17 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. Cousins on fire. 8 touchdowns, 1 interception in his last 3 games. And just a friendly reminder that the Vikings take on Washington on Thursday Night Football this week. One last honorable mention, Cam Newton. We're not sure if he's going to get his job back, but he's available in more than 50% of leagues. If you have an IR spot or a deep bench, he's probably worth a stash at this point moving forward. Among tight ends owned in less than 50% of leagues, here's who I'm streaming for week number 8, and we begin with Eric Ebron of the Indianapolis Colts. He is, to me, the number 3 target in this offense at this point with T.Y. Hilton and the emerging Zach Pascal at wide receiver, but he's still being used in the red zone for Indianapolis. Just 39% owned, and he gets to take on Denver this week. Last week, Ebron, 4 receptions for 70 yards and a touchdown against Houston on 5 targets. I think it's fair to wonder if there will be some weeks where he is the number 2 target behind T.Y. Hilton in this offense, and he has a very stable quarterback. Jacoby Brissett is killing it right now on the season, 14 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. I think Ebron will have plenty of chances to find the end zone against the Denver Broncos. Our next option at tight end is contingent on an injury, but it's Kyle Rudolph of the Minnesota Vikings. Adam Thielen left last week with an injury early in the game. We have to monitor his status with that Thursday night game against the Washington Redskins. But if Thielen is out, it appears Kyle Rudolph becomes the number 2 target behind Stephon Diggs for Kirk Cousins. In relief of Thielen in week 7, Rudolph had 6 targets. He converted those into 5 catches for 58 yards and a touchdown, by far his best game of the year. It seems he's only being used in situations where Adam Thielen is not on the field because Thielen and Diggs are so good they get most of the targets. But if Thielen is out, then yes, Kyle Rudolph becomes a streaming option at the tight end position. Moving on to streaming defenses, and like most weeks, we're trying to find a defense that's facing the Miami Dolphins, and this week we have one available, the Pittsburgh Steelers. And what's even better, they get to face the Dolphins coming off a bye. Imagine having 2 weeks to prepare for the lowly Miami Dolphins. That's what the Steelers defense gets. They're only 32% owned in fantasy leagues right now, and it's a fantasy defense that gets to take on a Dolphins team that is allowing 16 fantasy points per game to fantasy defenses. The Steelers D in general has been fantastic over the past month. 13 turnovers, 15 sacks in their last 4 games. And if you can't find the Pittsburgh Steelers on waivers this week, target the Indianapolis Colts, who are owned in even fewer leagues right now. They get to take on the Denver Broncos, who we thought had a plus matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs defense last week. Boy, that was wrong. That offense with Joe Flacco looks pitiful right now. The Colts are owned in just 16% of leagues. They have 7 sacks in their last 2 games against elite quarterbacks in Deshaun Watson and Patrick Mahomes. And in general, the Colts defense is allowing just 18 points per game over the past 2 weeks against elite offenses of the Chiefs and the Texans. Now they get to face Joe Flacco at home, coming off a big win against Deshaun Watson and the Houston Texans. Arrow pointing up for this Indianapolis Colts defense. Before we wrap up the show, it's time for Stealthy Starts. These are players that you should definitely pick up if available in your leagues among running backs and wide receivers, but I think the matchup allows you to also start them. And this player I was going to mention and pick him up at the start of the show, but I think you want to pick him up and start him. That's why he's a stealthy start. Lions backup running back Ty Johnson. We need to monitor Kerryon Johnson's health right now. He is the starting running back for the Lions. He left the game with a knee injury. In relief, Ty Johnson, the rookie, had 14 touches, including 4 receptions. He's only owned in 1% of leagues right now. But if Kerryon is out, a matchup against the New York Giants, and ask the G-men what they think about facing dynamic backup running backs after getting shredded by Chase Edmonds last week. So let's see what Ty Johnson can do, a dual threat running back. If Kerryon Johnson is out, Ty Johnson becomes a very stealthy start for week number 8. At wide receiver, John Brown. They call him Smokey for the Buffalo Bills, but he gets a great matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, who can't stop anybody right now. 2 blowout losses in a row for the Eagles, and John Brown has quietly become one of the more consistent wide receivers in fantasy football. Over the course of the season, he has 50-plus yards in every game this year. He has 5-plus receptions in all but one game. Philadelphia, 45 fantasy points per game allowed to wide receivers. That is worst in the NFL. And John Brown started in less than 30% of leagues last week. It's time to have some confidence in him. Start Smokey Brown against Philadelphia. Last recommendation among stealthy starts for week number 8, a rookie wide receiver in Seattle, but a beast of a man in DK Metcalf, coming off a season-high 9 targets against the Baltimore Ravens. It doesn't hurt when Russell Wilson is your quarterback either, and the matchup is pristine this week against the Atlanta Falcons, one of the more struggling defenses in the NFL right now. Metcalf started in less than 22% of leagues last week, but the Falcons allowing 42 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, 4th most in the NFL. Start DK Metcalf, who has less body fat than a gallon of milk right now. He is a great stealthy start for week number 8. Thank you so much for watching this week on the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. My name is Steven Andress. As always, if you have any fantasy questions for your particular teams this week, comment below here on YouTube and I will be happy to answer them. Good luck in week number 8.